Wasn't one incident. That's the thing people don't understand when I try to explain what happened. They want a single moment. The moment everything went wrong. But it doesn't work like that. It's more like water damage. You don't notice it until the wall caves in. I've been with the company for 11 years. 11 years of showing up early, staying late, learning every system, every quirk, every unwritten rule about who you CC on which email and why. I knew where the bodies were buried, figuratively speaking, and I knew exactly which filing cabinet held the documentation that proved it. My title was Vendor Compliance Manager. Not glamorous. Nobody at parties ever leaned in when I said it. But the work mattered. In a company that processed federal contracts, compliance wasn't a formality. It was the floor you stood on. Get it wrong, and the floor disappears. I had a good track record. In 2016, I flagged a subcontractor whose certifications had lapsed before anyone else caught it, saved us from a federal penalty that would have run into the mid-six figures. In 2020, during the chaos of everyone shifting to remote everything, I built an emergency render verification protocol from scratch in 4 days because procurement was signing contracts faster than legal could review them. My director at the time sent a company-wide email about it. I printed it out, not to be vain. I just had a feeling I might need it someday. That director retired in the spring, and that's when things started shifting. The new one came in from a consulting firm out of Chicago. Mid-40s, impeccable suits, the kind of shoes that cost more than my car payment. He walked into the department like he was touring a property he'd already decided to renovate. Politey, yes. But the politeness had a quality to it, like a contractor smiling at your outdated kitchen. He was already calculating what to tear out. His name was, well, I'll call him my director, because that's what he was. For a while anyway. His first move was rebranding the team. We went from vendor compliance to strategic supplier relations. He had new business cards printed. Same people, different cards. I remember holding mine and thinking, this is what a pivot feels like before anything actually changes. The second move was subtle enough that I almost talked myself out of noticing it. He started skipping steps. Not all of them. That would have been obvious. Just one here, one there. Vendor onboarding had a 12-step checklist. He introduced an accelerated pathway for preferred vendors. 8 steps, then 6. Then, by December of that year, 4 and 2 of those were essentially the same step worded differently. I raised it in our one-on-ones. He listened with the expression of someone waiting for you to finish a sentence they've already decided how to respond to. We're in a growth phase, he said. Rigid processes are the enemy of scale. I wrote that down when I got back to my desk, not because it was memorable, because I wanted to remember the moment I first heard the word scale used as a reason to skip documentation. I raised it again the following month. This time he had a name for what I was doing. He called it process anxiety. Not to my face, exactly. He said it in a team meeting generally, in the context of we need to get past our process anxiety if we're going to grow. But he looked at me when he said it, and the 2 junior analysts on my team looked at me too. I didn't say anything. I nodded like everyone else. But on my lunch break, I drove to the office supply store 3 blocks away, bought a cheap plastic file bin, and started keeping a second set of records at home. I know how that sounds. Paranoid, right? That's actually the word he used. 6 months later, in a meeting with my director and the VP of operations, when I presented a summary of the vendors we'd onboarded under the accelerated pathway without completing federal compliance verification, he used that exact word. She's always been a little paranoid about process, he said. He said it to the VP, not to me. About me while I was sitting 3 feet away. The VP was new too, brought in 8 months prior from a company in the defense sector. Big personality. She had a habit of filling silences so quickly you never had time to form your own thought inside them. She laughed, not unkindly but not kindly either, and said, well, we need our watchdogs. Watchdog? Like I was there to bark at things and then be patted on the head. I went home that evening and sat in my car in the garage for about 20 minutes before going inside. My husband could tell something was wrong. I didn't tell him the details yet. I just said, I think I need a lawyer, not urgently, but soon. He said, okay. He didn't ask a lot of questions. That's one of the things I love about him. I called an attorney the next week, not to file anything, just to understand what I was looking at. She was calm and methodical, and she asked me one question that reframed everything. Do you have documentation that exists outside of company systems? I did. The file bin at home had grown into 2 banker's boxes. I'd been photographing key documents with my phone, emailing summaries to a personal account, keeping a running log in a notebook with dates and direct quotes. Not because I was planning something, because something in me knew. My attorney said, "Keep doing exactly that. Don't remove original documents, just document what you observe." So I kept observing. What I was seeing, in plain terms, vendors were being approved for federal subcontracting work without completing the verification steps required under our government contracts. The missing steps weren't administrative, they were substantive. Background check clearances, financial solvency confirmation, conflict of interest disclosures. These weren't formalities, they were the things auditors looked for. The things that, if missing, could void a contract and trigger an investigation. I put together a formal memo in February, addressed it to my director and the VP, laid out the specific vendors, the specific missing documentation, the specific federal regulations implicated. I sent it through internal email with a read receipt. My director read it at 9:14 a.m. on a Tuesday. He called me into his office at 10:30. "I appreciate your diligence," he said, "which is corporate for. I am about to dismiss everything you just said. But I want to be clear that the accelerated pathway was approved by leadership. Your concerns have been noted." "Noted where?" I asked. He paused, just slightly, internally. "Can I get that in writing?" Another pause. "That's not how this works." "I understand," I said. "I just want to make sure there's a record." He looked at me for a long moment with the specific expression of someone who has just reclassified you in their head. Not a watchdog anymore. Something less manageable. 3 weeks later, I was removed from the monthly compliance briefing with the VP. My director told me it was a restructuring of the agenda and that my attendance wasn't necessary at this stage. I found out from a colleague that my slot had been given to one of the junior analysts, the one who'd been on the team for 8 months and whose main qualification was that he never questioned anything. I started attending a different meeting instead, one I technically had access to because no one had removed my calendar invite. It was the vendor approval meeting, lower level, operational. My director didn't attend it, the project coordinators did, and I sat there quietly and I watched what was being waved through. One vendor in particular kept catching my eye. A data services company out of Nevada that had been approved under the accelerated pathway. Their federal registration had a status discrepancy, not expired but flagged. I'd seen that flag before. It meant there was an open inquiry with the relevant federal agency. Approving them for a federal subcontract while that flag was active wasn't just sloppy. It was the kind of thing that ended up in Inspector General reports. I documented it, added to my file at home, sent myself an email. Then, in late April, I got a calendar invite. A meeting I'd never been invited to before, external audit preparation, Q2. I almost declined it out of habit. I'd been excluded from so many things by then that my default was to assume it was a mistake. But it wasn't a mistake. Our company was due for a scheduled audit by a federal contracting oversight body, the kind of audit that's routine until it isn't. And someone, somewhere in the process, had added me to the list, probably because my name was still on the vendor compliance org chart and nobody had updated it. I accepted the invite and said nothing. The audit was scheduled for the 3rd week of May. 2 auditors arrived on a Tuesday morning. They were professional, unhurried, the kind of people who've done this so many times that nothing surprises them anymore. They set up in the small conference room off the main hallway, the one with the broken blind that nobody had fixed in 2 years, and they started requesting documentation. My director handled the first day. He was smooth. He'd clearly prepared. He had binders. But on the second day, one of the auditors asked to speak with the vendor compliance manager. That was me. My director tried to redirect. He said I had moved into a broader strategic role and that the junior analyst could speak to compliance specifics. The auditor was polite. He said he'd like to speak with the individual whose name appeared on the federal compliance certifications. My name was on every certification filed in the past 6 years. My director couldn't argue with that without it looking extremely strange. So he said, "Sure, of course, no problem." And he smiled, the smile of someone whose stomach has just dropped through the floor. I met with the auditors for 2 hours. They asked about the accelerated pathway. They had clearly already seen something that concerned them. Their questions were too specific to be exploratory. They asked about the Nevada vendor. They asked about the documentation timeline. They asked who had authorized the pathway changes and whether those changes had been reviewed against federal requirements. I answered every question clearly and accurately. I did not editorial opinions. I did not volunteer what wasn't asked. But when they asked me if I had maintained records of my compliance concerns, I said yes. And when they asked if those records were available, I said yes to that too. I had brought copies, not originals. My attorney had been very clear about that, but printed copies of my personal log, my emails to myself, my memo from February, with the timestamp showing my director had read it at 9:14 a.m. The auditor looked at the memo for a while. Then he looked at the red receipt. Then he made a note. That afternoon, the auditors requested a meeting with the VP of Operations. I wasn't in that meeting, but I heard about it later, in pieces, from people who were nearby or who talked to people who were nearby, the way information always moves through an office, osmotically. Apparently, the auditor asked the VP a single question, not a complicated question, not a technical question. He asked, "Who approved the removal of steps 4, 7, and 9 from the vendor onboarding checklist, and what federal review, if any, was conducted before that removal was implemented?" The VP looked at my director. My director looked at his hands. The meeting lasted 12 more minutes after that. I found out what happened next through an email that went to the entire department the following Friday afternoon. It announced a leadership transition and thanked my director for his contributions. It did not specify where he was transitioning to. It was the kind of email that exists to create a paper trail of politeness around something much less polite. The VP's departure was announced 2 weeks later. That one was framed as a mutual decision to pursue other opportunities. My husband read it over my shoulder and said, "That's the corporate version of don't let the door hit you." The federal fallout took longer. I found out through my attorney, who was monitoring the situation. The company had to conduct an internal audit of all contracts touched by non-compliant vendors going back 18 months. 3 vendors lost their federal registration. 2 contracts were suspended pending review. The company paid a fine. I won't speculate on the exact number because I don't know it, but it was the kind of fine that shows up in a quarterly earnings call as a line item under regulatory settlements and makes investors uncomfortable. The Nevada vendor was among the 3 that lost their registration. Their open inquiry had been exactly what the flag suggested. I felt a strange mix of vindication and exhaustion when I heard. Not satisfaction, exactly. Relief that it had been real, that I hadn't been imagining it. The board called a meeting about the compliance structure. I was asked to present recommendations. Let me describe that room. 15th floor, corner conference room with a view of the river. Long table that seats 20. The chairs are the kind that cost more than office chairs have any right to cost. The board members were older. Mostly the kind of older that comes with good suits and the practiced stillness of people who sat in a lot of important rooms. They did not apologize to me. I want to be clear about that, because I think some part of me expected it, which was naive. What they did was listen. Really listen. The kind of listening where people's pens are still and their eyes are on you. And at the end of my presentation, the board chair said, "We'd like you to rebuild this." Not, "Thank you for your patience." Not, "We're sorry we didn't listen sooner." Just, "We'd like you to rebuild this." The offer that followed, the title, the budget, the scope of authority, was significant. I will say that. It was the kind of offer that makes you feel, briefly, like the institution finally sees you. And then one of the other board members leaned back and said, almost to himself, "Lucky we had her." Lucky. Like I'd been a feature of the office they'd overlooked. Like I was a good parking spot they'd finally remembered existed. I thought about walking out. I genuinely considered it for about 4 seconds. My attorney was 2 floors down in a coffee shop, waiting for my text. But I thought about the 11 years. I thought about 2016 and 2020. I thought about the memo I sent in February that nobody wanted to read and everyone eventually needed. And I thought, I'm not walking out of this room. I'm going to make them have to say my name every time they talk about what happened and what changed. I accepted the offer. The title is different now. The reporting structure is different. I have a direct line to the General Counsel and a seat at the quarterly leadership review. The accelerated pathway no longer exists. The vendor onboarding checklist is back to 12 steps, with 2 additional steps I added myself, based on what I saw in those 18 months of watching things go wrong in slow motion. My director, the old one, I heard he landed somewhere, a smaller firm, consulting. Maybe he learned something. Maybe he's doing the same thing somewhere else and hasn't been caught yet. I don't spend much time thinking about it. The junior analyst who got my meeting slot is still with the company. He reached out about a month after everything resolved, very carefully, in an email that took obvious effort to write. He said he hadn't fully understood what was happening and that he was sorry he hadn't spoken up. I replied that I appreciated him saying so and that if he ever had concerns going forward, my door was open. I meant it. The notebook I kept, the one with dates and direct quotes, is still in my desk, not at the office, at home, in the drawer next to my husband's old watch and a birthday card from my daughter that I've moved through 3 houses and refused to throw away. People ask me sometimes if it was worth it. The documenting, the meetings with my attorney, the months of being sidelined and talked about in third person while sitting in the room. I tell them this. I didn't do it because I knew how it would end. I did it because I knew what I was seeing was real, and I needed there to be a record of what I did about it, even if nobody else ever saw it. Even if it never mattered. It turns out it mattered, but that's almost beside the point. The compliance certificates that go out now, the ones filed with the federal contracting body, the ones that say our vendors have been verified and cleared and documented, they still have my name on them. They always did. The file bin I bought at the office supply store 3 blocks from work, the cheap plastic one, $8.99, turned out to be the most important purchase I made in 11 years at that company. Not the certifications, not the training courses. That bin. I think about that a lot. There's a version of this story where I don't buy it, where I tell myself I'm being dramatic, that I'm reading too much into things, that maybe my director is right and I do have process anxiety. That version ends very differently. The vendors stay approved. The audit finds what it finds. And when investigators ask who knew and when, there's no paper trail proving I tried. Just silence where a record should have been. What stopped me from becoming that version of myself wasn't instinct exactly. It was a kind of clarity about what I knew to be true versus what I was being told to feel. My director was good at making doubt feel reasonable. That's a skill, a particular and dangerous one, making the person who sees clearly feel like the problem. I had to learn to trust my own read of a situation, even when every room I walked into was arranged to make me question it. That's harder than it sounds. It took practice. It took sitting in my car in the garage for 20 minutes and then calling a lawyer anyway. Integrity, for me, wasn't abstract. It wasn't a value I listed on a performance review. It was the decision made quietly and repeatedly to document what I saw even when nobody was asking me to. To send that February memo even knowing it would probably be dismissed. To answer the auditor's questions accurately, even though accurate answers implicated people with more power than me. Every one of those decisions was small in the moment. The cumulative weight of them is what ultimately held the intelligence part. And I mean that in the practical sense, the ability to read a situation and think 3 moves ahead. That's what kept me from making it worse. I didn't confront my director dramatically. I didn't go to the press. I didn't do anything that could be reframed as insubordination. I kept my head down, and I kept my records, and I let the process do what processes are designed to do when someone actually maintains them. My attorney said it best: you didn't have to prove anything. You just had to have documented that you tried. And the endurance, the months of being sidelined, talked around, labeled, that part nobody really prepares you for. It's not cinematic, it's just long. It's showing up to a job where you've been quietly demoted in everyone's perception and doing the work anyway, because the work is real, even when the recognition isn't. Some days the only thing that kept me going was knowing the file was there, that whatever happened, the record existed. My director is somewhere else now. I genuinely hope he learned something. I'm not being generous when I say that, I'm being honest. A person who cuts corners on federal compliance because he calls it scale is eventually going to do it again, somewhere, to someone. The outcome next time might be worse for everyone. The board didn't apologize. I've made my peace with that. What they gave me instead was scope, the authority to actually fix the thing I've been watching break for 18 months. That's not nothing. That's, in some ways, better. The notebook is still in the drawer at home. I don't need it anymore. But I keep it there the same way you keep a scar, not as a wound, but as information. A reminder of what I was capable of when it mattered and what it cost, and that the cost was worth it. My name is still on the certifications. It always was.